Hello Admirals and welcome back to my channel where I talk to you about Battlefleet Gothic, the space fleet based tabletop game in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. So one of the major things I love about Battlefleet Gothic is not just the fact that it's massive kilometre long ships firing huge macro shells and lasers at each other. It's the fact that every single faction, every single fleet in the game feels different. They play differently, they have different strengths and weaknesses. And those strengths and weaknesses can be exasperated in the different scenarios that are played. And whenever you're playing one of those different fleets, it can feel very different, even if you play the same scenario. So I have to admit, this is probably one of the biggest sort of request I've had is, can you please do tactics videos and provide faction focused videos? So this video is going to give a little bit of a generic kind of overview of the official factions and kind of their basic strengths and weaknesses, and then future videos I'll go into sort of a recommended starter fleet and those strengths and weaknesses in a little bit more detail and do a bit more faction focused. So in this video going to go into sort of the basics of each of the official fleets. So yeah, let's kick it off with probably the first two that everyone kind of knows about. Let's start off with Chaos and Imperials. I'm going to kick all this off with a little bit of a disclaimer though, with saying that I've played with all the different fleets of Battlefleet Gothic, but I have varying degrees of experience with each individual one, and I have to admit that my Imperial and Chaos are probably the most played that I've actually in my time in the game, and then probably sort of things like Eldar, Orcs, and then probably Tau have probably my most experience, and then probably Dark Eldar and Tyranids after that, and Admech following that. So there are numerous sort of things to it, but so these are just my experiences playing over the past many years. Can't forget, I'm too old to remember how many now. So Imperials definitely one of the most played factions, along with Chaos. We'll start with Imperials because, let's be honest, most people will play probably one of these two main factions. So the Imperial Navy is probably the most common fleet used in the game, and it's probably the most, in my opinion, the most versatile out of all the fleets. The Imperial fleets don't have the most guns, don't have the most ordnance, and they're not the quickest by any means. However, what they lack in those specialities, they make up for in variety. The Imperial fleet has a wide selection of ships, from their cruisers, light cruisers, escorts, and their battleships, and they can deal with pretty much any situation, and they can cause some few surprises themselves. So they're a little bit of a jack of all trade fleet. They're very forgiving because of their strong armor at the front and decent guns and decent coverage. So due to this kind of approach, this jack of all trades approach, the Imperial fleet, more than most, needs to work as a unit. So I'm just going to focus. Yeah, so this is my typical speed. So they need to work as a unit to succeed. So keeping your main ships together in mutual support is key. It's one of the key tips I gave in one of my previous tactic videos. Keep your fleets together. What this keeping, especially with the Imperial fleet, allows them to do is easily react to a situation at hand and then mutually support each other and mutually support each other's firing arcs. The Imperial fleet, because it doesn't have as many guns as, say, the Chaos or others, needs to combine its firepower to really destroy ships, and to bring this into kind of simple terms. With your fleet, pick an enemy ship that you're concerned about and focus fire into it. Don't try and split fire. Individually, the fleet really doesn't excel. But when you combine them together to focus in on a particular enemy, that's when it really does excel. So that's your weapons. Also use your torpedoes to force the enemy into firing zones and to break up their fleet. So if you can start breaking up, if you keep yours fleet together and you can break up your enemy's fleet, then suddenly it makes it easier to just pick on the weaker elements of that fleet. don't forget your escorts and your light cruisers. They are your fastest kind of ships in the game. These are swords. And a lot of people kind of ignore them. They're little, they can be quite the surprise. And what a good sort of tactic to do is pair your escorts with a light cruiser and keep them behind your main gun line. This allows you to be maneuverable with them. It protects your vulnerable rear and also prevents ships that are faster than you outflanking you. You can use your escorts in light cruiser to stop and at least engage that sort of element. But keeping them in touch and distance allows you to use your mainline cruisers and your battleships to soften up the enemy. And potentially when, say, you've picked a target and you've crippled it, for example, then it's perfect pickings for an escort squadron coupled with a light cruiser or just an escort squadron to really hammer that home, because it can really pose a pretty big surprise, to be perfectly honest. But keeping them behind your mainline cruisers with their 6 armor prow, which is the best armor in the game, allows you to keep them alive. If you throw these out in front, they're more likely to be picked off and easy victory points for your enemy. Just quickly on the Imperial fleet, they have something that no other fleet has, and that is a Nova Cannon. Nova Cannons are basically the longest range artillery and really the only artillery in the game, and they can reach out and hit something from, well, up to like 100 and basically across the board, 160 centimeters or something like that, something like 180. They can hit anything on the board. Now, while it used to be a lot more reliable when you could guess the range, now it's scatter dice. They're a little bit less reliable. But I would I'll go into a little bit more detailed video on Nova Cannons in the future. But I would recommend taking some Nova Cannons in an Imperial fleet. Probably no more than 1 per 500 points to be sensible. But I typically will only have 1 or maybe 2 at most in a fleet for Imperials, purely because it's not fun, but also they're too unreliable with the scatter dice to really base your strategy around. But when they do hit, they can cause some serious damage and really soften up or break up a fleet very, because no one wants multiple Nova Cannons hitting their ships and causing a critical or crippled ship within one shot. In some instances, these guys can one-shot light cruisers and things like that in opposing fleets. So I would recommend taking Nova Cannons, but don't base your entire strategy around them. And finally, for the Imperial fleet, keep an eye on the Emperor-class battleship. She is the darling of the fleet. Okay, and then flip side to that, the beautiful Chaos. Really powerful fleet, put very simply. They're real heavy hitters. They have some of the most powerful ships in the game. Their cruisers, pound for pound, are probably the best in their game. Carnage, Slaughter, Styx, Devastation, Hades. Hades is a darling. No, don't leave home without a Hades heavy cruiser, to be perfectly honest, in the Chaos fleets. But they have a lot of guns, and they're actually quicker than the Imperial ships. So they do have lighter armor. So while it is tempting to try, and because they're faster and have bigger guns, it is tempting to just throw your ships into the thick of it and turn it into a bit of a war, a battle of attrition, a bit of a gunboat battle. These ships will likely lose in that war of attrition, and you can quickly start dropping ships or having ships crippled. So while it is tempting to throw them in and think they're a bit brawlers, I would say don't. I would say be advised that your lighter armor can be a significant downgrade on other ships. But their improved speed and their improved weapons certainly lends itself to flanking maneuvers. Dual slaughters together can be really quick along the flanks, can put out a lot of damage, as well as if you put marks of chaos on them, like a marks of Khorne, where they can board really well, then suddenly you have a very fast, powerful ship that can board enemy craft without them really being able to respond. They also have the kind of the added bonus, the Chaos Fleet, of having some of the longest ranged guns in the game. They can get up to a good 60 centimeters range, which really does put those pesky Eldar and Necrons on alert, because being able to reach out and hit those ships at a distance, can really soften up those enemy fleets before you then get into them with your bigger guns at closer range. Chaos also have really, really good carriers. They have the Styx and the Devastation are actually very, very good. And while it's much maligned in the community, I actually think the Despoiler battleship is a really good battleship as well. So they really can hold their own in the ordnance battle. They have enough ordnance to be able to mix it with Tyranids and Tau, to be perfectly honest, and keep up a really good ordnance war there. Now, because their cruisers are so good, their escorts can become a little bit redundant. So you won't often see a lot of escorts being used in a Chaos fleet. However, Chaos don't have regular sort of access to torpedoes or boats or anything like that. So I would recommend having a look at their little torpedo version, their little torpedo boat, because it can be very, very useful to just have that squadron of 3 or 4 torpedo boats to use as a screen and to pick off other torpedoes coming in from, say, the Imperial fleet or potentially the Tau fleet, so that you can use them as a little bit of an ordnance screen, for want of a better word. So keep that in mind. While it's easy to kind of ignore the Chaos escorts, don't necessarily completely ignore them. I have mentioned it, but squadroning cruisers in a Chaos fleet is just generally in fleets in general is good, but squadroning 2 ships together for the Chaos fleet is really a good tactic, especially if you've got like 2 Carnages. If you're facing against an Eldar fleet that can put out like 36 weapons batteries to the side, which will kill anything basically. But 2 Slaughterers together, really, really quick, putting out 28 weapons battery at 30 centimeters to the side. Being able to outflank and use that is incredibly powerful tactic for the Chaos fleet. And I did mention it, Marks of Khorne and Marks of Chaos in general are really, don't ignore them. They do cost money, but certainly points, not money. But they certainly are useful. Marks of Khorne can really up your boarding. Marks of Nurgle prevent that boarding back, so if you're going against something like an Orc fleet which want to board you, Marks of Nurgle preventing that really does stymie the tactics against you there, for example. And Marks of Zinch and Sunesh, where you get rerolls and things like that, always useful if you potentially are going to fail leadership rolls. So yes, highly useful marks. Keep an eye on those, I would say. So let's go on to some of the Xenos fleets now. We have Necrons and Orcs here. We'll start with Orcs, who tend to get a bit of a bad rap in BFG, and this tends to be because of their slower speed, their perceived low ordnance, and because they have poor rear armor. So their front is 6, their side is 5+, and their rear armor is 4. So when they get hit with bomber waves, which always hit the lowest armor, they can do some really serious damage to Orcs. So so they have this sort of bad rap. Now, while the armor is something you can't change, the lack of speed can be negated due to the fact that they have a special rule which gives them an automatic success of leadership to any all-ahead full orders. So when a ship from Orcs want to go all-ahead full, they can automatically do it. Now, you don't have as many dice as usual, but they don't have to pass a leadership to do that. So they can negate that speed problem by literally your entire fleet can go all ahead full. So using this order can very much get the Orc fleet within their hard-hitting distance. And it is typically what a war boss should be attempting to do straight away in most scenarios, is getting as close as you can. So a lot of these cruisers and even escorts have some really short range guns, like 15 centimeters, but they're called heavy guns, and they can double hit, so they can do double damage. So if you get within that range with those sort of all ahead full, you can really do some serious damage to a fleet. And a lot of admirals may not be expecting you to be able to suddenly be up in their grill with an orc fleet because of that perceived slowness, essentially. Now, in the earlier part of this video, I mentioned that Imperials, you like to keep your escorts behind the main line so you can sneak out and cause some damage. In an orc fleet, do the opposite. Put your escorts out at front, especially your plucky little ram ships. These things are aiming, they have got weapons, but they're aiming to actually just ram their counterparts. So if you get these escorts and start hitting cruisers and even battleships with a 3 or 4 squadron of these, they can easily cripple and destroy even the biggest of ships. So putting them out front, no one likes to see this threat coming at them. They're actually terrified, and they can be a really good distraction from your main hitting heavy guns. Or alternatively, what orcs really want to do is board. So boarding is a huge thing for orcs. They get bonuses in it, not amazing bonuses, but they do get better bonuses than most other fleets. So for every 500 points in your orc fleet, you can have a war boss on a cruiser, and what that does is doubles your boarding value on your cruiser hull. So suddenly you have a better boarding. You have a ship that can all ahead full, being distracted. Everyone's being distracted by these things that can do damage, and then you can board with those cruisers, which, because they innately have more hit points than most other cruisers, are already going to be ahead. So when you double the boarding value, you have higher hit points, you're better, you get more bonuses as an orc in it, you suddenly are really starting to cause some serious damage in boarding. And it's not outside the realms of possibility that an orc cruiser can cripple or outright Hulk, turn a ship like an Imperial or Chaos Hulk or Eldar, whoever, or even Necrons if you can catch them, completely Hulk them when boarding. So that is a really big tactic for orcs that I definitely would be recommending. Now the other one, that perceived sort of lack of ordnance, is also a bit misleading as well. As orcs, those heavy guns that I mentioned, orcs can kind of pick and choose weapons, and so they can choose and elect to replace those heavy guns with ordnance bays. So suddenly you can actually, by doing that, put a lot of fighter bombers out as an orc player. Something that surprises, I think, a lot of admirals is the sheer number of fighter bombers that can be put out. And because of the randomness of some of the guns and randomness of the number of ordnance tokens and torpedoes that can be put out, suddenly you could be facing a huge wave of fighter bombers or torpedo bombers or something like that there's absolutely no way of them being able to manage, and you can overwhelm your opponent very, very quickly unless there's someone like a Tau or Tyranid player. So that really does not only help you put out an offensive ordnance and keep up with the ordnance side that way, but it also means that you can kind of negate that 4+ rear armor, because if the enemy is dealing with these huge amounts of fighter bombers and torpedoes, they're not worrying about trying to hit you with their own ordnance, and then that can lead you into that boarding action, which is where you want to go. So that's a couple of little bit of tactics tips for the orcs. They are a hard fleet to play. I'll be honest; they're probably the hardest fleet to really consistently win with, especially in certain scenarios. But they are really good fun, as in anything 40k with orcs, always good fun. Necrons. You probably actually don't need much of a tactical for Necrons. They came into the game late, and in reality probably are conversely to the orcs probably being the weakest fleet in the game. These guys are probably the strongest fleet in the game in reality. They have really strong armor. They have loads of guns. They're really fast. yeah, they can do some serious damage, and you can really you can alpha strike really easily with these, because they can be so fast. They don't have any ordnance though, so that's probably their major weakness. If they can get overwhelmed by ordnance. I think the key sort of aspect for these is that they give up a lot of victory points if they start to get damaged and lose ships. So because of their victory point rules, they give up more victory points than, say, their opponents in any other fleet. So if you're opposing them, picking on one of... I would always ignore the tomb ship, to be perfectly honest. Don't bother trying to attack it, it's too powerful. But if you can get either a scythe or one of their light cruisers on their own, and you can really pick on them, especially their light cruisers, which have lower hit points, then you can potentially get a really big win against them, because by destroying one of these ships, they give up all their victory points, or even crippling them, and you can also get them to fade out really easily. And suddenly, by doing a bit of damage to them, especially with things like ordnance, they can suddenly start to disappear from the field very quickly. So if you are playing as Necrons, you want to watch to make sure that you don't have a ship that is suddenly isolated and staring down. They usually, pound for pound, can pretty much stare down 2 to 3 cruisers each. Their scythes, and the tomb ship's just unbelievably good. So that's not gonna... You don't have to worry about that ship, to be perfectly honest, most of the time. So you don't want to be in a situation where you're being sort of singled out, because quickly that could turn the game around, not in your favor. So I personally, if you were playing Necron, I probably wouldn't put in a shroud. I think it's really easy to try and take that one out. It's probably the weakest link in the Necron fleet, and I probably would argue that taking dirges or jackals, their escorts, is probably better, but each their own. That's just my personal sort of experience with them. So if you are the Necron player, I would say you can definitely outflank, you outgun pretty much everything, and you have really good armor and really good saves. You get automatic saves because of their metal armor, but do be wary of ordnance, do be wary of being picked on, so keep ships in mutual support. And because you don't have shields, keep a watchful eye on things like radiation bursts and solar flares, which can do damage. If you're facing Necrons, getting them to brace for impact is actually really good, because they typically have a 2+ save, which when they brace for impact, they lose and they get a 4+ save instead. So suddenly, you could actually be doing more damage when they brace than when they don't. So as a Necron player, you've really got to consider when you're actually going to be bracing for impact. Really consider that as an option. Continuing the completely alien and Xenos sort of fleets, we have Tyranids and Eldar Corsairs. So we're going to start with the Tyranids this time. I'll start on this side. So the Hive Mind and Tyranids have a unique sort of movement system, whereby sort of the Hive ships kind of control what's kind of going, and if these ships are not within sort of range of a Hive ship, then they go on to something called instinctual behavior, and there's a table in the rules which kind of instructs you on what to do. So important to keep these guys alive. So what that kind of inevitably occurs is people new to the Tyranid fleet often find the instinctive behavior to be difficult to deal with. But sometimes this actually can rather be a help than a hinder once you know how to deal with it. But I won't go into the full details of sort of the Hive Mind and the instinctive behavior in this video, but I will in a future video. But failing the instinctive behavior doesn't necessarily mean all is lost. For instance, it can help auto-pass reload orders, for example, and to get your ordnance back. So sometimes it may be even beneficial to let ships go out of range of a Hive ship to then auto-pass things. But that will be... You got to get a grips with it, and these are probably an interesting way. It's just an interesting, different way of playing the game, to be perfectly honest. They do not play the same as any other fleet. But one thing, if you are a Tyranid, if you are the Hive Mind Admiral, and you are going for it, you really need to keep your Hive ships alive. If you really want to know kind of what you're doing, the key to victory is keeping Hive ships alive and having a number of them, honestly, in your fleet. It can be very tempting. So when you're making a Tyranid fleet, you can basically add and subtract weapons, and you can customize ships how you want. You can add bioweapons on it, you can add scything claws on the top if you want to get in close and do some damage. So it can be tempting to kind of go overboard, especially on your Hive ships. But I would say the more Hive ships you have in a fleet is more beneficial in ensuring you know what to do, rather than having a tooled up Hive ship, which becomes a really meaty, juicy target for someone to try and attack. So definitely I would be, looking at more of your Hive ships to make sure your fleet is doing what it's supposed to be doing, rather than less and potentially putting out a nice big target on it, if I'm honest. But giving a Hive ship max ordnance and decent weapons batteries at long range will offset the weakness of the fleet, perfectly honest. So if you can add some long range weapons to it and add some ordnance to it, with your choices, I would say that's probably the best loadout for Hive ships. It then provides mutual support for your closing ships to get in close and potentially board. They, like orcs, really like to board. Tyranids want to munch on the get in, open the can, and munch on the lovely meaty stuff inside, right? So they get bonuses as well in boarding actions as well, and they have extra weapons like tentacles and claws to really do some damage in close range. So using these guys to offset these guys' weaknesses, it's a mutual beneficial sort of arrangement sort of thing. It's easy to go close, kind of load up on close range bioplasm because of the rules on that, but don't necessarily always jump to that, I would say. But certainly in the vein of basically if Tyranids, your aim with the Tyranid fleet is to slowly weaken your opponents as you progressively move up the board, get in close, board, hit them really hard with short range plasma claws and things like that. A neat little trick is to put feeder tentacles on your escorts and sail them in amongst the enemy fleet. It will do absolute havoc. Just put it that way to the enemy fleet. Watch as it kind of disintegrates about you. Tyranids actually, it's interesting because you don't think they could, but they can actually put out the most ordnance of any fleet in the game. They can put out the most amount of torpedoes, fire bombers in the game, assault boats, that sort of thing. Those are the categories rather than what they're called in for the tiny fleet, but you get my point. They can put out the most if you choose to by quite a long way, and really only Tau can probably keep up with them in that ordnance kind of superiority game. And a neat little trick they have is that you can actually purchase ordnance at the start of the game before deployment occurs, and you can put a nice little fighter screen out already on the board. So as you're closing, as you're attempting to close on the enemy, you can use that as a bit of a fighter screen to stop them softening you up. So overall, there's a tendency to over sort of buy weapons for a Tyranid fleet. I would say don't. Have specific roles for your ships. This is I'm going to zoom in. Have key roles for your ships. Stick to it. Aim is to soften fleets up as you close with them, and the ultimate aim is to hit them hard and board with your Tyranid ships. And if you get in close with a Tyranid fleet, you're probably going to win. That, to be perfectly honest, they are probably pound for pound the best close range brawlers you can get in the game. On to probably one of my favourite aesthetically kind of pleasing fleets, I think. The Eldar Corsairs are some of the nicest looking ships kind of they designed. The Voidstalker's definitely one of my favourite designed ships, I have to admit. Now I'm going to be talking about the original rules here. The Eldar have some unique rules which allows them to move, shoot, and then move again in the ordnance phase. So there has been rules written in the community where they don't do that. There's different alternative fan-made rules where they move, and then shoot. There have been other rules again for that. But I'm talking about the original rules where they would move, they shoot, and then they move in the ordnance phase again. That is... Honestly, that's actually, I know there's a lot of people, there's differences of opinion, but that's actually my favorite rule set to play. I actually like the uniqueness of it, and while it can be frustrating, difficult, and they can be really pesky to catch, I do enjoy that rule set. The best thing to think about the Eldar Corsairs is they are very much a hit and run fleet. They are classic glass cannons. They've got really good weapons. Whenever they are aiming their weapons batteries at you, they're always closing regardless of the orientation of the enemy ships. They have really good lances. They have really good ordnance that if for example, their torpedoes, if they miss, they get to re-roll to see if they hit, things like that. Their torpedoes and ordnance are harder to hit than others. You've got to go roll a 6 to destroy them rather than a 4 or 5 or 6 against like others. So they can be a very frustrating fast quick fleet. So they're very much hit and run raiders, pirates kind of thing. So that's how you want to play them. Get in, hit hard, and run away. Because if you get caught at all, they're going to fold like wet paper. They are not... haven't got as many hit points by any stretch of imagination compared to other fleets, and their armor is a lot weaker. So 4+ is typically on most ships with the Eldar Corsair fleet, but they can hit really, really hard with their various weapons batteries and lances. So you want to realistically get in, hit whatever target you're aiming for, and then run away to prevent your enemy essentially shooting at you back. Avoiding being out of range, or hiding behind celestial phenomena like asteroid fields and things like that. They will be shredded if you get caught out in the open, put very simply. And critical hits are easier to get on Eldar ships as well. So if you do get caught, suddenly your ship could either be completely blown away or suddenly become very ineffectual because critical hits start to stack up. Escorts. Now you will see a lot of Eldar escorts are probably pound for pound the best in the game. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking right now. Pound for pound though, they're probably the best escorts in the game. These are nightshades, but their hemlocks and things like that are all, and aconites are all very, very good. And an all escort fleet is very viable for Eldar. Although probably not quite in the spirit of the game, I would find, but they are very viable. They're incredibly powerful because of the Eldar rules around torpedoes and ordnance, and a single lance on say a hemlock can go 3 points of damage and suddenly can be racking up, when you've got a few squadrons of them, can start racking up hits even against battleships. So I would be an advocate of using a lot of escorts in Eldar fleets, but don't ignore their cruiser hulls. I actually quite enjoy the various different like Shadow, Eclipse, and even their light cruisers can put out quite a significant amount of damage. Like the Aurora and Solaris can put out some good amount of hits as well. So don't ignore them, but definitely keep an eye on the escorts. They are, and so if you're facing off against Eldar escorts, do not ignore them. You ignore them at your peril, quite frankly. So one thing that will make or break an Eldar fleet, though, is Celestial Phenomenon, for one, because solar flares and radiation bursts, because they don't have shields, can put blast markers and do damage to these ships. But also the sunward facing edge. So the way the Eldar move is depending on where the sun is, their solar sails make them faster. So if they're facing away, moving, or perpendicular, it changes the speed at which their ships can move. So if you're an Eldar player, you really want to keep an eye on where the sunward edge is. Always keep that in mind, because suddenly a savvy opponent against you could suddenly make you be facing the wrong direction, and you suddenly become very, very slow, and you are then caught out in the open very, very easily. So if you have a savvy opponent who knows how to maneuver their ships really, really well, and box you in a bit of a corner, then suddenly your ships can easily be caught out in the open and easily destroyed. So Eldar Corsair pirate leaders, always know where your sun is. 100%. Sticking with the Eldar theme, these fleets are very, very similar to the Corsairs in many respects. So this is the Craftworld Eldar and the Dark Eldar. So similar to the Corsairs, as I say, they hit just as hard with their weapons batteries and ordnance and lances. The one thing that the Craftworld have going for them, though, is they have a little bit more staying power. So the Corsairs typically have armor of 4. The Craftworld typically have armor of 5. Now that doesn't sound like a much, but suddenly can really, really help, quite frankly. So suddenly they're what's the word I'm looking for? Cruisers, that's the word I'm looking for, can stick around a lot easier, and they can take more damage and potentially stick in the fight longer. The benefit of the fleet is that both the Wraith and the Dragon Wraith, can swap their weapons out. So you can customize the fleet, their mainline cruisers, to your playstyle, and also to basically who you're potentially facing as well. So it's quite a versatile fleet, and you can kind of make it what you want in many respects. So it does suffer, though, the same weaknesses that the Eldar do, but a little bit less because of that armor. But they still do. If you get catch them out in the open, they still can fold a little bit because they're lower hit points. So you still can't quite throw them in as a brawling fleet, but they can deal a little bit with that compared to their pirate kin. Now, Dark Eldar don't do the whole move, shoot, move rule like Corsair or Craftworld Eldar, but they are still incredibly fast. Now, only 2 models were produced for the Dark Eldar. A cruiser called the Torture, and their escorts as well. Now, the one thing with that, though, is while that doesn't sound like a lot, they're customizable. So again, very similar to the Craftworld sort of cruisers here, you can create a Dark Eldar fleet to your will, basically, and you can decide how you want them to operate. And in theory, you can create 5 different cruiser hulls and about the same for the escorts, I think, from memory. So again, versatile fleet provides variety, and you can customize your playstyle essentially. Now, while they don't do the move, shoot, move rules like their Eldar brothers and sisters, they do cause issues with their speed. So you want to use their speed to their advantage. Mimic engines, which basically allow you to hide and not take hits until really whenever you want, essentially. They basically turn invisible. It's easy to spam that, but I would say be careful with that, because if you get caught, then suddenly you may lose a cruiser very quickly. But they are mimic engines are incredibly useful. So the weapons batteries and lances for the Dark Eldar do a very similar thing to what the Eldar, Craftworld and Corsairs do. Something that is a little bit different, though, are their leech torpedoes, which are pretty much the only thing very different to anyone else. It's very unique. I can't think of any other sort of weapons in the game that are similar to that. But essentially, it slows down the opponent. So if you hit an opponent with leech torpedoes, it takes minus 10 centimeters off the speed of that ship. Doesn't do any more damage, but that's what it does. And it can stack the number. You can't cause it to go backwards or anything. You can only ever get minus 10 centimeters, but the number you do stack, and they have to repair each one individually. So suddenly, if you hit, say, a battleship with multiple leech torpedoes, it suddenly can't turn. And maybe you've hit it 3 or 4 times, and so they have to repair that 3 and 4 times before it can even turn, because of the nature of battleship rules. So suddenly you can become incredibly maneuverable and cause your enemy to not have that maneuverability. So I personally think the Dark Eldar can really shut down fleets with their ability to do that, and they're a really good fleet to have flanking maneuvers with, and really kind of pick on a core and like pick a target, outflank, and really pick on a particular target that you want to aim for. I really think that's a really viable tactic for Dark Eldar. They're fast enough to be able to avoid that sort of thing, especially when if you put a few mimic engines around, and then causing leech torpedoes and things like that can really do some serious sort of, allows you to control the board, which in any war game is also is incredibly effective. The Impaler is also a unique weapon for the Dark Eldar, but I'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but in a future video. But they're probably more situational, the Impalers. They cause hit and run attacks, or you can cause victory points, things like that. Useful in campaigns, but maybe not necessarily in one-off sort of raiding or fleet action games. So incredibly fast, hit hard as well. They do suffer the same as Corsairs, and if you catch them out in the open, they're going to fold very, very quickly. But you can, with mimic engines and their speed and movement around and maneuverability, they can hit pretty hard and then run away really, really quickly and avoid that kind of issue that their Corsairs fall under. Onto the home stretch now, Admirals, with the Xenos race. We have the Tau. The Tau have two different fleets, but you can mix them. There are fleet lists that let you do that, but originally had the Games Workshop Merchant Fleet, or what they're called the Explorer Fleet, essentially. And then you have the Military Fleet, essentially, which was originally from Forge World. But like I said, you can mix them, but they are good to keep separate, I find, because they have different strengths and weaknesses. They do play together quite nicely, but it's kind of nice to play them as two separate things. Now, I have to admit, many people don't actually like the original Tau from Games Workshop. I personally really like the aesthetic. That's my personal thing. I do like the sort of the Manta, Barracuda kind of looking fleets as well, but I have to admit, I have a soft spot for the original GW one. Now, they can do similar different things. They do operate in similar, but Ordnance is the obvious big one for these fleets. Both put out a vast majority of torpedoes and fighters and bombers. Their torpedoes operate slightly different as well. They can actually, you can choose the speed at which they go at, and you can also change their direction. So unlike other torpedoes where it's fire one and done, these guys can actually turn their torpedoes. So suddenly you could have a different tactic that you're facing, where torpedoes can suddenly move towards you, which you're not usually expecting. The original GW fleet, I think, is often overlooked for the newer sort of Forge World one. But I would say that that pound for pound, these guys probably can put out a lot more ordnance than these guys. But these guys can probably put out a bit more weapons, battery and lance, or railgun fire per se. Both fleets operate as more of a standoff fleet. So if you think back to sort of the Imperial and Chaos ships, they often are kind of depicted as Napoleonic era. You cross kind of the T. Whereas these ones kind of think of Midway and the Japanese and American fleets, where they're putting out loads of torpedoes and loads of fighters and bombers to try and take on the enemy that way, while also then firing long range battery fire and things like that. So these guys can put out a bit long range. They can go up to 45 centimeters, a lot of their batteries and things like that, while also pumping out a lot of ordnance for that. So this fleet kind of wants to sit back and punch at long range and at mid range and go from there. So you want to kind of maneuver your fleet to support each other, but in both instances to do that. Which can lead both fleets to being very susceptible to failing their ordnance orders. So you've got to be really, really careful as a Tau Admiral that you want to keep putting out that ordnance and that damage output. The moment you start to fail orders, or even if your enemy fleets start to make you brace for impact before you've been able to reload your ordnance, that's a common tactic that you can use against them. So then the Admiral needs to choose, am I going to be able to put my fighters and bombers out on torpedoes, or do I want to protect my fleet with brace for orders? You can't do both. So that's a common one you've got to be very wary of as the Admiral, but against them, yeah, your aim will be to try and get them to brace while they haven't reloaded their ordnance, and that drastically decreases down their ability to damage you and keep up with the sort of the ordnance superiority that they have. The one good thing about the merchant fleet is actually they're quite cheap, pound for pound. They're probably some of the cheapest you can get in there. The Hero class cruiser, for its points cost, is probably the best cruiser in the game, to be perfectly honest. And the Explorer battleship, while only having one shield, you can have multiple Explorers in a fleet compared to maybe only one or two most battleships. They don't have the similar sort of rule. So a really good fleet for the merchant fleet are 3 Explorers and 3 Heroes, and then adding in a couple of escorts where you can to help buff them. Because you don't have those limitations like you do with other fleets of battleships. But you can only take 1 hero, because in reality that's the only actual decent cruiser in the game for this for the merchant fleet. You can only have 1 of them per ship, so you have to have another ship to get another one in. So if you have 3 Explorers and 3 Heroes, that's actually a really, really, really powerful fleet. Do not underestimate by any stretch of the imagination. The only issue, I suppose, with this fleet is there's another light cruiser in this, which is the Merchant class. I have to be honest, that's the only ship in the entire game that I have not found a role for. So if you find a role for this, let me know, because I still haven't found an actual role or how to play that properly. I find it either too weak, too slow, doesn't put enough, it goes down, gets killed easy for victory points. It's really tricky. So if you find a way to use it, let me know. But certainly, if you're opposing an Explorer and Hero fleet, don't underestimate it by any stretch of imagination. And the Humble Defender escort can pose a few surprises, so don't underestimate the Humble Defender. With the Corvesh fleet, which is the Forge World fleet, they do have better armor than the Explorer and have more shields, and they have greater firepower, like I said. So you can be a little bit more aggressive with this fleet than with the merchant fleet. And I would say the Custodian battleship at the back here, this guy, is probably up there as one of the best battleships in the game. It can easily outperform a lot of other battleships at the same sort of class. Now, finally, for both these fleets, do not let anyone board you, ever. So, on the flip side to something like the Orcs and the Tau, which they just want to get in, and even to a less degree Chaos and Space Marines, these guys have debuffs for boarding. So you do not want to be boarded as Tau. They will fold really, really quickly if you get into a boarding action with Tau. So keep them out of that range. Unless you're my mate, BFG Noob, who boarded one of my protectors with a strike cruiser, and every day of the week should absolutely annihilate it, but somehow the plucky protector survived. I have no idea how to this day. Dice gods were kind to me. But you want to be trying to avoid boarding at all costs when you're Tau. And finally, both sets of fleets can get Xenos allies. So you can get Demiurge, Nikasa Dows, Kroot War Spheres in these fleets, and Xenos escorts. They can plug a little bit of a gap in these fleets. So for instance, Demiurge are pretty strong and have a good amount of punishment, good amount of hit points. So if you feel that you're a bit pound for pound weak, armor-wise and hit points-wise, then a couple of Demiurge ships can really plug that gap and can really focus fire on that rather than your more fragile ships. So they're worth the sacrifice. They're worth keeping an eye on those sort of Xenos ships as well. Now, it wouldn't be 40k if you didn't have Space Marines, right? If you didn't have the poster childs of the actual game itself, then it'd be a bit silly. So, what to say about the Adeptus Astartes? Well, for a start, they're incredibly strong armor. So, everywhere on this fleet, 6 armor, most powerful amount in the game. So they can pretty much shrug off weapons battery fire, but you've got to be very careful against lances that can sort of circumvent that. So if you're going up against a pretty lance-heavy fleet, you've got to be very careful there, and you've got to be kind of a little bit more protective of it. But certainly against sort of bombers and torpedoes and weapons batteries, they can shrug off them pretty nicely, and they can kind of deal with that. Now, conversely, their weapons batteries and their bombardment cannons, which use the weapons battery table, but hit like lances, can cause a lot of damage back. So a six strike cruiser strong fleet with some attendant escorts won the Adepticon tournament last year. So they are not they're a powerful fleet, so you've got to be very careful with them. So not only can they put out a lot of weapons batteries and a lot of bombardment cannons that can do damage, their main weapon is actually their Thunderhawks, in my view. Thunderhawks can completely shut down enemy fleets. So they can put out a lot of ordnance as well, strike cruisers and battle barges and things like that. And Thunderhawks can do hit and run attacks. They act like fighters and bombers, but when they attack, rather than doing automatic damage like bombers do, they do critical hits, and they do it very, very well. So suddenly, if 3 or 4 Thunderhawks can get through on a ship, they can completely shut down a ship's ability to be able to move or fire back or reduce leadership, etc., etc. So their ability to be able to completely shut down the opposing fleet while then backing up with weapons batteries and bombardment cannons do damage can really, really be a very powerful tool. And they're also relatively pretty quick strike cruisers. They can turn 90 degrees and things like that. So the downside is their weapons are typically 30 centimeters range. So you've really got to get in to the enemy to really actually do some damage, and because they're a bit slower, faster fleets can tend to get around them. So that is a little bit circumvented by the fact that they can turn 90 degrees. So you've got to be very wary of that. Space Marines also really, really good at boarding as well. So they get bonuses, and they can get things like Terminators on it to improve the boarding actions. So they have multiple ways in which to do some damage, to be perfectly honest, and to keep your opponents guessing. Now, one thing I would note with strike cruisers, as your only real cruiser, you can get sort of Imperial cruisers and things like that, and venerable cruisers and things like that in your fleet. But typically, your main cruiser and your main powerhouse is going to be your strike cruisers in most games, along with your battle barge, battleship over there. They have less hit points and less shields typically than your regular cruisers. So you can pay points to get an extra shield on your strike cruisers, and I would 9 times out of 10, 99.9% of the time, always recommend you do that to get that extra shield. They are really good. They're cheap cruisers. They're only 145 points, and it only costs 15 points extra to put an extra shield on, and it will keep them alive longer, especially when you've got 6 armor prow. So really, really good at moving forward. You want to get in. They're a good brawling fleet. You want to get in, do some damage with your bombardment cannons and your weapons batteries, while trying to then potentially board with often multiple squadron strike cruisers to do some maximum damage. All the while, you soften up the enemy with Thunderhawk waves to really shut down their ability to fire back at you. So when you couple that with the fact that they've got really strong armor, they can be a really, really powerful fleet to deal with. bit circumvented if you know you're playing against Space Marines. People tend to take a lot more lances, but if you don't really know they're coming at you, they can be a really powerful fleet. And don't forget teleport attacks with these guys too. That's a really good thing. So if you are Adeptus Astartes captain, you've got to keep in mind that you're a bit slower normally and you have lower range. So you really want to try and maximize getting in, doing some brawling, and you probably in a war of attrition will likely win that. And using your strike cruisers and your escorts to try and funnel more pesky Eldar sort of fleets into your guns is a good viable tactic as well. And then the last of the Imperial fleets would be Adeptus Mechanicus. I mean, these guys they actually bring the Titans to the tabletop and the battlefields, but Adeptus Mechanicus, I should say. So the Adeptus Mechanicus fleet is similar in many ways to the Imperial fleet generally. They don't get access to battle cruisers like the Imperial fleet do, but every one of their cruisers gets a 60 centimeter lance, and you can put a Nova cannon on it. And also, they get to roll on sort of special Adeptus Mechanicus tables to see if they get special extra bits. So there are downsides to that, but their upsides quite often outweigh that. Things like targeting matrices, which improves your gunning, or better thrusters to improve speed and things like that. You can get, like I said, kind of get some negatives, but on the whole, you can get some really good positive sort of things on that table. And the Arc Mechanicus is a really powerful battleship that can really, really put out a lot of firepower and a lot of ordnance. They benefit from that same sort of Imperial tactics, so keeping them together, focusing on a target. They benefit from 6 armor prow and things like that, just like a normal Imperial fleet. They have less options because of that lacking in battle cruisers, but with that extra 60 centimeter lance, suddenly you'll be surprised with a few Nova cannons and then suddenly having 3 or 4 cruisers throwing out a few 60 centimeter lances, how quickly that can soften up fleets, especially if they're not used to dealing with an Imperial fleet that can reach out and touch at that distance and hit at that distance. So a few Nova cannon shots and a few lances can suddenly cripple 1 or 2 cruisers coming at you. Soften them up enough for then you be able to do more damage when they come in closer to range with more standard weapons. So they can get extra goodies. They can be detrimental, but they can prove some huge benefits and boons to it. But they do suffer from that similar sort of issues that an Imperial fleet does, where if they get broken up or picked on, they can't pound for pound take on other more dedicated gunboat style ships. You've really got to keep them together, maximize your firepower output, similar to an Imperial fleet. So, Admirals, that's a little bit of a breakdown, a real brief overview of each sort of fleet strengths and weaknesses. They're the official ones. There are also rules officially for rogue traders, running Demiurge and things like that on their own, as well as Inquisition as well. But they often work similar to Imperial or Tau kind of tactics. And there are various unofficial fleets as well that the community have made, things like Sisters of Battlefleet or Dark Mechanicus, things like that, or Xenos races like a more up-to-date sort of Space Dwarf, sort of League of Votan fleet list and things like that. And there are heresy rules which go into specific Space Marine Legion fleets, which I'll cover in future videos. But I hope that gives you a little bit of flavour of the tactics and a little bit of the strengths and weaknesses for each fleet for now. And we'll go into more sort of detailed faction starter fleet focus fleets for you to start and flavours in future videos. I'll probably start with Imperials and then Chaos to move on. But if you have a preference, or if you have any tactics of your own that you have found, leave them in the comments and let me know. Up till then, thanks everybody, happy gaming, and I'll see you soon.